I'll provide just a brief background on Milena Leibold as well. She's a PhD fellow at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. She's interested in the phenomena of organizational openness, communication, strategic change, inclusion and exclusion, and grand challenges, with a capital G, capital C, grand challenges. Currently, she's also looking at how patents, regulation, funding sources, and other factors impact open science and creativity. Ms. Leibold, welcome.
Thank you very much.
We'll actually give a brief introduction to her work before we start the panel.
Yeah, but I'm also fine with Mr. Church starting, so no worries. He has already started.
Indeed, yeah. So, Dr. Church, please take it away.
Well, I'll be very brief because I think the panel itself will be far more interesting. And I just wanted to bridge the panel with what Alex Tabarrok just said, which I thought was a terrific exploration of many of the nooks and crannies here. I think the main critique that I would have of how this whole discussion that has been started impacts us is that there is the possibility of getting clinical trials, some kind of clinical trials, way down below the $100 million mark. And in this particular case, the per dose cost, even for very small runs, was on the order of $1 or less. So what one really needs is a system where safety is assured. Forget about efficacy for a moment. That reduces the elimination. You don't need challenge trials or non-challenge trials. You just need to show that it's safe, which most categories of vaccines are. And then you need to get it. Then that allows you to get it to a large population where you really will find out the safety, because some of the safety concerns that come up are like 1 in a million and that sort of thing. And eventually you need efficacy as well. So I thought those were two interesting points, which was the incredibly low price, even at low scale, and then safety with that efficacy as a way of getting things out to a large number of people if we have extreme need. But I want to get on to the questions in the panel discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Church. And Ms. Leibold, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and introducing a bit of your work that is most relevant to what we're talking about.
Yeah, I tried to be short. Okay, so yeah, hello, and thanks for inviting me to the panel today, and also for introducing. I'm here today as a representative of a research team, I would say, of 4 people who investigate creative processes that are influenced by regulatory uncertainty. And we investigate those processes, and we are particularly interested in creative processes such as the development of a vaccine that occur in collaborative settings which approach and organize intellectual property differently. And this led us to RaDVaC, and RaDVaC gained our attention, I would say. And the overall assumption for our project is that creative processes are influenced by feelings of uncertainty that might come up when thinking about whether the result of this creative process, for example, a vaccine, is new and valuable, and thus may be worth to be protected, and or whether it might infringe some rights of others when making the results publicly available, and what the risks of this development and also of the publication processes are. And we call this uncertainty that is linked to IP regulatory uncertainty. And I found it very interesting today morning that Mr. Preston Estep asked for an IP lawyer with regards to the mRNA vaccine. And in former research, we investigated creativity and regulatory uncertainty in dominant regimes within the music and pharma industry. And what we found was that the regulatory environment is usually taken as given. And I think that is something that also Jutta Paulus today mentioned. And we found that IP professionals help actors to cope with uncertainties by absorbing or transforming uncertainties. And we now want to know what if actors do not take IP environment as a given. So what are alternative approaches to patenting or copywriting, and how are they applied in practice? So we take a look at the landscape of regulations, but also other sources of uncertainties that might influence how these approaches are shaped to develop novel and valuable and accessible results. And yeah, we are convinced that this is highly relevant to investigate, and particularly to gather some policy relevant findings about how pharmaceuticals and vaccines can be developed beyond the patent regime, and what is needed to sustain these alternative models, and what is also needed to help actors within these models to cope with emerging uncertainties, like maybe RaDVaC is facing at the moment as well, that come up due to using this alternative model. And we think RaDVaC could be an ideal case to study these creative processes that might be somehow influenced by uncertainty. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting example, and that's because it's not just a vaccine or just a company. It could become something like an ecosystem, and therefore rather a model for organizing IP differently. Yeah, and to conclude my brief remarks, I believe that our global society at the moment could now use the momentum. The whole patent waiver discussion could be something like a start of something bigger for a larger debate also on how vaccines and also pharmaceutical products are developed, produced, and distributed. And I think RaDVaC yet is in an early stage, but we are happy to see it develop and learn from that. And at the end, I think we all who are here would at least like to contribute to this debate that is starting on alternative modes of organizing vaccine development and access in the future. So I think it's important to experiment and to learn and then argue based on empirical evidence. And that is, I guess, applicable for you as a scientist, Mr. George, and the RaDVaC team, but also for us as organization researchers. I think the most important is that we need to achieve the way by collaborating and sharing knowledge. Yeah, and now I'm happy for participating in the panel. Thank you.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you so much, Ms. Leibold. Obviously, there's much to discuss, much to unpack in terms of the economics that underlie vaccine development, past, present, and hopefully future. One of the questions that I think many of our panelists here have addressed is sort of the risk, and I did bring this up in the earlier panel as well. Dr. Church, while we have you with us, a question that may be best answered by you, but then opened up to the group. Obviously today, and certainly in the history of RaDVaC, as we've gone back more than a year, we've embraced this sort of Linux model of collaborative open source software translated over to vaccine development. And so in your view, what are the possible differences, strengths, weaknesses to, to that sort of metaphor?
Well, at first blush, you might imagine that Linux is not a matter of life and death, but it is. Almost all technologies have some low frequency of morbidity and mortality. So many devices now are controlled by Linux. If any of them malfunction, you can end up with someone getting damaged by machinery, say, or missing an appointment, all sorts of things. So that's actually a similarity rather than a difference. I am very respectful of the costs of doing clinical trials, and for that matter, all the other R&D costs. But if you have a series of costs, a collection of costs, and you hold the whole reduction of costs hostage to all of those, you can't make progress. So you need to take them all off the table and then put back in the minimum ones that you need to make progress. And there are certain categories that are unique. For example, those which are extraordinarily safe. Typically, for example, nutritional supplements get a pass. Nutritional supplements have risks, however. Software gets a pass. So I would say that we've lost billions of dollars due to software errors in security and so forth. And those billions of dollars are somewhat fungible into lives because that money was not available for medical applications. Maybe we should move on to the next panelist or question.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, thinking about the systems in which Linux, is a supportive infrastructure, many of those systems do sort of have a direct impact on life and death. I think there's multiple public utilities and healthcare infrastructures that rely on software. Some of the most fundamental components of which are based on open source technology. Professor Tabarrok, you mentioned that vaccines weren't in your mind necessarily a generalizable technology or a platform. And Dr. Church, I kind of wanted to get your perspective, and Dr. Estep as well, both as scientists thinking about the vaccine platform as was developed through RaDVaC and by others, right? mRNA is an adaptable platform for developing vaccines, and likewise within RaDVaC we use a peptide-based approach that is fairly really rapidly adaptable, to update, to iterate upon. For us that was a feature, certainly with open sourcing in mind. So I wonder if either of our biologists would care to sort of expand on the adaptability of vaccine platforms, in particular, maybe specifically the one that we've leveraged at RaDVaC using peptides, or perhaps others.
So one of the analogies that I made in one of my earlier slides about Linux and how we can use examples from Linux, I think that much of the activity in Linux and patches and updates in Linux actually are for security reasons, right? To prevent various malware, ransomware, from traveling through the internet, hiding in various locations in servers and cloud operating systems. I think that vaccines it's a very, very similar analogy to vaccines, right? These updates are boosters. That's their primary function. The primary function of Linux, when many large organizations are thinking about making a new installation, is security, right? And security is a very good analogy to immunity. So we need our computational infrastructure to have a really good immune system. And we need those constant updates as boosters to digital pathogens. Very similarly, we could create a vaccine infrastructure that is more responsive. All you have to do with software, right, is find a pathogen risk, write some code, and then, upload it into your server. It takes a much longer time. It's a much bigger investment, to do that with human beings. But with the level of proven safety of vaccines, I think we should find a model for how we can do those updates much more readily. Not exactly like just uploading them to the server, but make them more agile so that we can respond in time, so that we don't have a year-long wait so that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are dying.
Let me say a few words on that and platforms. Mark Andreessen said that, software is eating the world. And I think what's interesting about the mRNA vaccines and also the peptide vaccines is it really is software, right? So the vaccine was designed and started to be produced even without the virus. The virus was not even necessary. Literally, the code was transmitted over the internet, and then the vaccine starts to be designed based upon that. So I do think there's something there could be an issue with IP. Patents can be too broad. Right. So if we're going to have a debate, maybe in the future, about should Moderna and Pfizer and so forth get patents on applying mRNA to, treating heart attacks, maybe their patent could be too broad. That, I think, is a totally reasonable debate to have. One of the things I've been pushing back against is this idea that we could increase production, tomorrow by limiting IP. I think that is just simply not true. And so that's the sense in which the specific vaccine itself is not a platform. However, some of the higher level ideas, do have aspects of a platform. And there, I think we can talk more readily about the virtues of tinkering and open source and IP on those kind of higher level ideas.
Yeah, that's, I think, the way we had conceptualized it at RaDVaC as well. That we develop a platform that can be iterated and adapted upon and tinkered with, at low cost, at high speed, and ultimately to be run in parallel in multiple iterations. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that.
I just want to chime in real quickly.
Sure.
A big part of the immune system, especially when you use a delivery vehicle and an adjuvant that have been used many times before, a large amount of the immune response is going to be very specific to that vehicle and that adjuvant, right? So one of the goals that we have as scientists in assessing the effectiveness or efficacy of a vaccine is to be able to do this completely with biomarkers or immunogenically. Just take blood samples, saliva samples, nasal swabs, and run a variety of tests on them, and do that before vaccination and then after vaccination, and look at the response to those markers to make a prediction about whether or not somebody has correlates of what we call correlates of protection, right? Whether or not the vaccine actually protects them against infection. I think we're very close. I think, in research technology, we're there. We have those tools. They're very, very expensive, though, and we haven't rolled them out into the public domain and paired them with vaccines. But one of the things that I think we scientists know is coming and want to see implemented in the very near future is companion diagnostics that are prognostics that you use proof. Every time you take a vaccine, especially for a very deadly disease, you take a test to tell you whether or not the vaccine has worked and whether or not you're protected against that disease, right? So we call these confirmatory tests, a vaccine confirmatory test. I think there is a lot of research technology that is very mature and that can be deployed into those kinds of tests, but they're just not ready for prime time. But one of the things that this pandemic has done is really accelerated the timetable for the maturation of those kinds of tests.
Yeah, I think we could go deep into deep immune profiling, and certainly both applications for confirmatory testing and also for clinical trials and challenge trials in ways that are both faster and more effective, but also more ethical, right? That we reduce the amount of risk that we subject people to within clinical trials. So again, we could go on and on about that, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and move on to some other questions. And certainly, Dr. Church, while we have you, I know you have a pretty extensive background in developing either totally public entities that serve as infrastructure for researchers around the world in an open source way, certainly with the Personal Genome Project, but other projects as well. So I was wondering if we could get your thoughts on what are the features of public-private investment models that can support the development for open source approaches to something like vaccines. So the features of those partnerships or the features of those investment models.
There are there's a continuum terminating in special cases that include extreme need, for a rapidly progressing epidemic of any sort, possibly non-infectious, but nevertheless urgent medical needs, that happens, and that's one axis of a unique nature. Another one might be extraordinarily low cost, and another one might be extraordinarily low risk. So high need, high medical need, low cost, and low risk. And I think those came together in this case, not early enough and not effective enough. But the point is we're getting ready for the next one. And the infrastructure that we could have would be, one might be, there are many things that are made public enough that you, for example, get a license or implied license that you can make a personal photocopy of something. You can have your own Mona Lisa without really infringing anybody's rights. So that might also should be possible in this case, because if the scaling is such that it isn't that much more expensive to make your own personal dose, if it isn't that much more expensive to make, photocopy or laser print your book, then that might be a good way of distributing it. And you can be constantly ready because you know the resources that you need for making RNA or proteins, or DNA for that matter, and all of that could be distributed in such a way that makes it also less fragile, because there's no one point where you could drop a bomb on it or otherwise paralyze our infrastructure.
Yeah, certainly.
Thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think we've maintained some of those thoughts internally at RaDVaC as well, being anti-fragile as on a way of addressing that through decentralization, right? And other open source institutions like Linux, like Wikipedia, like the Personal Genome Project, these they have central resources but decentralized governance and decentralized sort of evolution, right? That they could be iterated upon in a decentralized way. And so for us at RaDVaC and Dr. Estep, I hope you'll join me in thinking this, and I'm not speaking, out of turn here, but, that essentially driving down cost of participation would have downstream effects, right? Of improving access, both to the output, right? Both to the vaccines themselves, but ultimately to the participatory process, or driving up participation in the process of producing, testing, regulating, validating, manufacturing, and distributing vaccines. So everything that goes into that product, as well as the products themselves. So yeah, I think it's probably good to get the input of our economists here on the notion of anti-fragility and decentralization as a way of improving access, improving maybe the rate of success or the possibility of success. Dr. Lowe, you were very articulate in kind of explaining the sort of risk math that goes into the development of vaccines. So I'd love to get your perspective on decentralization as a means of improving overall outcomes.
Well, I think like in many different industries, the biopharma industry is no different in the sense that I think both can actually play a role. If you look at the technology industry, you've got a lot of open source software initiatives that have really transformed the industry. But at the same time, you also have patented software and for-profit companies that focus on a very different business model to, Richard Stallman. So I think that in the same way, I see RaDVaC as playing a critical role, a new role that really hasn't been played before by any kind of a biopharma company, except in rare instances where they've made certain ideas and patents available for public health reasons. So I think, in order to have a robust ecosystem, you want to have both. A certain degree of decentralization is always good for creativity and encouraging innovation. But at the same time, there are certain issues that we really can't rely on decentralized solutions, issues that involve ethics, issues that involve public health, issues that involve public goods. So those are examples where economists would argue that government intervention is appropriate in the right measures and under the right kind of structure.
So I would add to that. I think there's a distinction to be made between the production and the consumption. Production is going to, some of it's going to be decentralized, but because of economies of scale and other advantages, some of it you need mass production. But what we are seeing is definitely a trend towards personalized medicine. And that is going to force decentralization on the world. It's just going to come slower than we might hope because the FDA is kind of pushing against that. The FDA kind of has a randomized controlled trial model, which doesn't really fit personalized medicine, right? So if you are literally designing a drug or an intervention for a single person due to changes in their biomarkers in their bloodstream, you can't do a randomized controlled trial on that because there's no other people, to stand in as substitutes. Now, so I do think we need to push the FDA on these grounds. There are things like the Apple Watch could do a lot more in terms of measuring individual biomarkers and heart rate and temperature and things like that. But they've been slowed down by the FDA. Same thing with things like 23andMe, which measures DNA, right? To me, there's a free speech issue here, and that is you have a right to discuss and to know anything that's going on in your body. And the FDA has said, no, that's not true. The FDA has pushed against that, arguing that not just the technical aspects of tests should be regulated, but also the information. And the FDA has said, look, people could, if they get some piece of information about their DNA, they could make a rash decision, and therefore that's unsafe, and therefore we're going to regulate it. And I think that's really problematic.
Can I add one thing to that point that Alex made regarding the personalized medicine in clinical trials? There actually is an innovation that the FDA is involved in on using adaptive platform trials to be able to allow individuals to engage in a certain degree of personalized medicine while at the same time being part of a larger kind of an effort to determine safety and efficacy. So I think that with the innovation of this notion of adaptive platform trials, there is a way for us to incorporate that into personalized medicine that I think satisfies all parties' objectives.
Yeah, very interesting. Dr. Church, I know we're a little past 2 p.m., so if you need to take off, that's quite all right. And we thank you for your time.
Thank you all.
Absolutely. We'll be in touch soon.
Thank you, George.
So question perhaps for Ms. Leibold. I think, we had spoken previously about some of the ways that risk plays, and certainly, most of your work in this new project is about how risk plays into the development, perhaps the innovation of new technologies. I wondered if perhaps you had some perspective on the impact of, various kinds of de-risking mechanisms towards medical technologies or other technologies that we might translate over to vaccine development. I think we certainly had some uncertainty about the regulatory landscape that we were emerging into, but sure, well, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are not specialists in vaccine development, also not in the former research, but it was rather on pharmaceutical development. But what you see in the pharmaceutical development is that tendency to patent everything you can. So this is already an action, I would say, against uncertainty and to minimize a little bit the risk. So you try to make sure that no one else develops something that goes into the direction of your invention, and you want to be attractive in the future for investors. So I think the usual practice is to make your garden of patents as big as possible. And that is also already quite a resource-intensive process. And I think that leads to also uncertainties in creative processes by others, for example, who might maybe not stick to the dominant patent regime, but they somehow need to cope with it. And for example, people need to check databases of patent applications and try to find out whether they infringe some patents already in place being used or not. And for this job, you also need legal professionals, IP professionals, because it's quite tricky. And I think it's especially tricky for startups, for example. And I think when thinking about de-risking vaccine development by making it open source, that could be like the way to provide more transparency about the source, and maybe to also like have not that many resources that need to check for everything. Of course, that's like the best case, but so many resources are used to lessen uncertainty, and that comes, of course, back to the alternative model of having something centralized, maybe also like a foundation that could be RaDVaC in the future. I don't know. So to have a centralized foundation that also makes the smaller decentralized parts coping with uncertainties that are linked to these regulatory practices in place. And I also think that the transparency part could also be an advantage when it comes to trust, as we've discussed today morning, and mistrust into vaccines, of course. That was a long story, but yeah, I think that is a process of de-risking somehow, or at least coping with some uncertainties that come up.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I wanted to follow up quickly on the sort of give a brief history of RaDVaC's perspective on patents. When we formed, there had been a sort of a new standard set and validating Milena's statement about people patenting everything. One of the things that had been happening in the last few years is that companies like Tesla and Amazon had announced that they were patenting a variety of things, but had no intention of using those patents for anything except to protect themselves against other people claiming to own the IP, right? So one click ordering on Amazon, they famously patented it and said they weren't going to use it. Tesla patented a bunch of things and then opened up their patent portfolio to other companies. That's one way of dealing with that kind of uncertainty. But another way of dealing with the uncertainty is what we chose to do. We chose to, as soon as we had assembled a sufficient amount of potentially protectable information, we publicly released it. And once you make a public release, technically nobody can patent it, not even you, right? So there's another, there's another way to share information and prevent other people from using it against you, and that is to just put it out into the world. And that's what we chose to do because we didn't want to get involved in any hair-splitting discussions about who owns and what intellectual property, maybe even become tempted, to do some licensing deals. People have, and organizations have approached us about licensing and royalties. And it was just so much easier to, so much cleaner for us to just say, we don't even own this, right? Nobody owns this. You own it as much as we do. And that's what we've told everybody.
Yeah. To expand on that also, those conversations almost inevitably ended in the topic of exclusivity, right? Where, the notion of taking something that was really intended to be, as widely accessible as possible and turning it into something that is exclusive to one or two, institutions or actors, it ran counter to kind of the nature of the project and really, the solution to what is a global problem. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. And I think this leads to a great question that we've gotten about some of what the risks, right? What are the risks of, certainly with the TRIPS waiver, right? This proposal of waiving patent rights for, existing patent holders, existing pharmaceutical companies who've clearly, invested both public money and private resources in the development of vaccines. And while, there's certainly an argument to be made for the ethics of making vaccines accessible right now through some amount of patent waiving. I'd love to hear your perspective, Dr. Lowe and Professor Tabarrok, on the long-term risks of that kind of patent waiver.
Yeah, so I have to say that I was, really shocked and horrified when I heard that the Biden administration supported the suspension of patents. It seems to be exactly the wrong thing to do, because I agree with Alex that you really need to support innovation and keep in mind that there are enormously talented people that are working in this industry developing these therapeutics, and they need to be rewarded for their hard work. I think actually a better approach would have been to simply buy the companies outright. You're right, there is an ethical dimension here. And if the United States government decided that it was unethical to charge people for a life-saving treatment like the COVID-19 vaccine, what they could have done was to basically buy Moderna. Moderna's current market cap is about $67 billion. $67 billion seems like a lot of money, but in March, the Biden administration signed a $1.9 trillion relief package to deal with COVID-19. $67 billion is exactly 3.5% of $1.9 trillion. So if we felt that it was so important from an ethical perspective to provide that to the world, we could have purchased Moderna, and then produced not only COVID-19 vaccine, but from that point forward, produce all sorts of cancer vaccines and various other vaccines, and had given it away if we wanted to. That would actually send the right signals. It would encourage more people to get into the business. It would provide the rewards of all of the hardworking individuals and the creativity that went into developing this vaccine in record time. To me, that seemed like a much more reasonable solution than basically punishing the people that actually came up with the vaccine that has saved hundreds of millions of lives.
Yeah, I agree with everything Andrew said. That was a brilliant summary. Let me say something which is a little bit nasty, but I'm going to preface this by saying I love RaDVaC. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled with the approach. I'm thrilled to be on the panel. But so keep that in mind. Here's something. Here's my nasty statement. Look. The RaDVaC vaccine is way more exclusive, okay? Way more exclusive than Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson. Millions of people have had Pfizer, okay? I think we're hundreds of millions. I don't know if we're up to 1 billion. We're getting close. Millions of people have had the Pfizer vaccine, okay? I don't know how many people have had RaDVaC, like 1,000 to 2,000, something like that. I don't know. Way smaller. So the RaDVaC is much more exclusive. And look, in this race, I'm going with a horse which got me here. And so the patent system, for all its faults, it got us the patents with Operation Warp Speed, with a bunch of funding, just like Andrew was talking about. Okay, we funded the clinical trials, which was totally the right thing to do. We subsidized building of the factories, totally the right thing to do. Okay, so that package together has gotten us life-saving vaccines in a radically shortened amount of time. So let's not give that up too quickly.
Well, first of all, I don't think what you said was nasty at all.
Okay, good.
I don't look at the truth as nasty. Like saying, I think Charles Barkley said, "It's not boasting if you can do it." So I agree with you. But mRNA vaccines were invented in the last, probably 15 to 20 years ago. Actually, even though there's modern patents, there's patents from the last few years and from last year, specific to SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. There, a lot of that IP is actually getting a little bit older in the patent framework, right? It's going to go off patent in the next few years. What we're looking at, I agree. The investment in research and development and the overall scientific infrastructure has been spectacular for the success of therapeutics generally and for vaccines. But that's public money, right? The majority of that money that went into the research of mRNA vaccines was public money. Some of it was supplied by pharmaceutical companies, but often what happens is, pharma only picks up an innovation and starts to run with it when they see that commercial viability is on the horizon, right? So there was like a decade and a half of public funding of mRNA therapeutics and vaccines long before there was Moderna and BioNTech. And so, I don't see that there's a reason to try to take over what BioNTech and Moderna have done. But the question for us is there another way, another slightly different path to using that public investment, right, to translate that into therapeutics that is maybe more collaborative and open sharing, very similar to Linux, than the purely patent-driven exclusivity model that we see at work in Moderna and BioNTech. And I think the answer, it's very interesting when we look at the history of Linux. Linux did not come from Silicon Valley and venture-funded companies of startups and hundreds of people and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. It came from one guy who needed to do something where he needed some feedback from the community. Linus Torvalds has said that he started Linux purely for one reason. He thought it filled a need that was more widely needed than by himself alone. And the only way to get comments from the community was for him to write the software, right? So he made a deal with the community. I will write this software if you give me comments about how to improve it. He had no, grand vision about reforming the world or, changing proprietary software into free software. He wasn't Richard Stallman. He only wanted to create a synergy, of feedback, so that the people writing the software could get the fastest and most effective feedback about how to respond and make the product better. And so Linux, for the first 10 years, it was only really, hardcore nerds, hardcore operating systems gurus who had any interest in it. But at some point, they created something collectively that all of a sudden, to the rest of us, was this very, very powerful, competitive set of capabilities that that the rest of us needed some of, right? And then so they got Linux got put on internet servers, and then the cloud started happening, and people thought, oh, well, actually, it's a really good idea to build the cloud on a particular set of uses. Oh, well, Linux actually has all these features, right? So the cloud, so Amazon Web Services, the initial instantiation was built on Linux, right? So it took multiple incremental steps and multiple tangents away from the original intention of Linux. But, once there was a community built up and invested in it and were making, important contributions, it just took on a life of its own. This was a true grassroots, worldwide, massive success story. And now one fork of Linux powers the majority of mobile devices in the world too, Android. So we're not, as we dream of maybe, this is going to be an alternate model for everybody to make vaccines in 20 years, who knows, maybe, maybe not. But if we start very simply with a toy alternate path, right, and just say, this actually does something useful that nothing else does for us, which is RaDVaC, which RaDVaC fills that description. Maybe we can, and now Actovera Pharmaceuticals actually has signed on to that vision. They're producing pharmaceuticals for testing in preclinical and clinical trials. And it only takes a few more and then, have some sort of network synergistic effects for us all of a sudden to start looking like Linux did in its early years.
Yeah. So can I build on that with a couple of observations?
Please.
So first of all, if you take a look at the history of Linux and go back to the original Unix that was developed by a number of programmers, Kernighan, Ritchie, and others, it turns out that that original operating system was incredibly powerful, really useful, but it turns out that it also had a number of security holes. In fact, the security holes that existed in the original version of Unix, these back doors that allowed people to get in, that created huge exposures that we're still dealing with today. And Linux closed some of those holes, but it turns out that it's given the advent of cyber risk, we now realize that we require certain kinds of commercial grade protections that are not necessarily available to open source software, simply because the resources to have a team of cybersecurity experts just don't exist. In addition, we also need to have the patents of encryption to be able to deal with some of those issues. So that's an example where there's a really healthy ecosystem of open source software working hand in hand with commercialization to be able to give to the commercial entities what they need and to allow the public entities access to what they need. And so what has been missing from the biopharma landscape is that open source piece, which I believe RaDVaC has now provided. And that's why I'm so keen on what you guys are doing. Whether or not it's particularly effective for COVID, I realize 2,000 doses seems, ridiculously small and exclusive, but it's a proof of concept. It took $5 billion to sequence the human genome. The first one was $5 billion in today's dollars, but now we can sequence it for $600. So I see RaDVaC as playing a really important role in showing us what can be done. And so I think that there's room for both.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more. Right, I think it's clear, to anyone who's been in biology and biotech that that ecosystem is lopsided, right? And this open source infrastructure has yet to develop in the way that it has for cybersecurity and for software development. And so we are 24 minutes over time, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's schedules for the day. And I know that it's quite late in Austria, so thank you, Milena, for joining us. I want to leave the room open for final thoughts from each of you in terms of how best to move forward. Either whether in your respective works or guidance for the development of open source platforms and filling in this sort of missing niche in the ecosystem of vaccine development, where you feel like open source development or open source resources like the toolkits that we're developing might be useful. So please, the floor is open, and just for some last thoughts.
Well, I just want to say real quickly that as Alex Tabarrok correctly pointed out, designing and making vaccines is actually pretty cheap. So we need to extend that strategy and that mindset to clinical trialing too. It needs to be a package deal.
Yeah, and in software development, you work with SDKs, right? You work with software developer kits, and I think that what RaDVaC has begun to do is develop vaccine development kits or vaccine developer kits, right? A good SDK contains a compiler, right? A way for people to generate code and tinker with that code, and then a debugger. And you translate that model over to vaccine development, and we have a compiler, right? We have the white papers that describe both the research and the specific instructions and the specific sort of formulations of a vaccine candidate, or at this point, 10 vaccine candidates, soon to be more vaccine candidates. But then the debugging is really in the preclinical and clinical trials, right? The studies that examine the safety, the efficacy, the dosing of these vaccine candidates. So, I think for us, that's a valuable way of conceptualizing what we do. But yeah, again, I do want to open it up for other people to reflect on that.
Let me close with this. There's been a few silver linings to the crisis. One of them, I can buy alcohol online. Two of them, second, I can consult my doctor online. This has been great. I hope we don't re-regulate on that issue. And the third and biggest, I think, is RaDVaC, and it's very exciting. And I've been thrilled to be part of this.
Yeah, maybe some thoughts. I think we are all on a learning journey, and there are some examples in the past of alternative approaches that failed, and I think that is also important to learn a little bit about them for making some implications for RaDVaC and how to make it better. Some might have been more successful, and I think to support such a project or infrastructure to come into being and maybe come into being in 20 years. I think we all need to help together and see what we can learn from it and see it really as a model. I don't see it as an exclusive vaccine or something like that. It could be far more.
Dr. Lowe, I don't know if you had final thoughts.
I share the sentiments of my co-panelists. I think that this is an enormously exciting initiative, what you guys are doing at RaDVaC. And I certainly am not qualified to give you any advice on the scientific mission, but I can say on the economic and financial side, I would encourage RaDVaC to consider strategically what the economic considerations are for certain areas that can easily be scaled using the private sector, but there are other areas that cannot easily be scaled and where RaDVaC can have maximum impact. So I think, thinking about the economic issues hand in hand with the scientific and medical issues would be really important, and where I think you can greatly multiply the impact that you've already gotten.
Terrific. Well, thank you all. We have benefited from each of your respective works greatly, and I expect that we will continue to do so. So I look forward to being in touch with all of you and to keeping an eye on your future works. And I hope we can be of value to you as well.